everyone, and welcome to the Surviving Savannah book launch. I'm Jessica Osborne, one of the owners of Savannah's oldest independent bookstores, E. Shaver Booksellers. We're so pleased you're able to join us to celebrate the launch of Surviving Savannah. It's my honor to introduce you tonight to the New York Times and USA Today best-selling author of 15 novels, Patti Callahan. She is the recipient of the Christie Award, Book of the Year, the Harper Lee Distinguished Writer of the Year for 2020, and the Alabama Library Association Book of the Year for 2019. Patti Callahan is the co-creator and co-host of the weekly web show and podcast Friends and Fiction, featuring the 5 best-selling authors Mary Kay Andrews, Christy Woodson Harvey, Kristen Harmel, and Mary Alice Monroe, with endless stories, special guests, and a way to connect readers, writers, and booksellers. A full-time author and the mother of 3 children, she now splits her time between Mountain Brook, Alabama, and Bluffton, South Carolina. Joining her in conversation tonight is Mary Kay Andrews, a native of St. Petersburg, Florida. She earned a BA in journalism from the University of Georgia. After a 14-year career working as a reporter at newspapers, including the Savannah Morning News, she left journalism in 1991 to write fiction. In 2006, Hissy Fit became her first New York Times bestseller, followed by 12 more New York Times, USA Today, and Publisher Weekly's bestsellers. To date, her novels have been published in 9 languages. In between cooking, spoiling her grandchildren, and plotting her next novel, Mary Kay is an intrepid treasure hunter whose favorite pastime is junking and fixing up old houses. Tonight's event is to benefit the Ships of the Sea Maritime Museum, which was founded in 1966. The museum exhibits ship models, paintings, and maritime antiques, principally from the great era of Atlantic trade and travel between England and America during the 18th and 19th centuries. The museum features 9 galleries of ship models, maritime paintings, and artifacts. The vast majority of the ship models are commissioned by the museum to interpret the rich story of Savannah's maritime history. Patti is very excited to answer your questions. You're welcome to enter your questions into the chat throughout the presentation, and we will collect them to be asked during the Q&A. If you would like to purchase any additional signed copies of Surviving Savannah, please visit eshaverbooks.com, where you can order the book online. If you would like to make a donation to the Ships of the Sea Maritime Museum, please visit their website, shipsofthesea.org. And without any further ado, I turn it over to you, ladies.
Thank you, Jessica.
Okay, Patti, let's launch this book.
Let's untie the ropes and set this baby out to sea.
You know, Patti, you have been talking to me about this book, I think since the moment you got the idea.
Yeah.
But why don't you tell the audience about Surviving Savannah?
Okay, imagine, if you can, not so long ago and not so far away, you are with your family on the wharf of the Savannah River. You are about to board one of the most luxurious and fancy steamboats of the day. It is June 13th, 1838, and you are about to board this ship. You paid $35 for your ticket, and you are going to sail past Tybee Island, up the coast to Charleston, spend the night, and then head to Baltimore. You expect a beautiful and lovely night with only 1 night at sea. But then, that's not how things work out. At 11:04 p.m., in the middle of the night, in the middle of the ocean, the starboard boiler goes empty, and the second engineer pours in cold water, and the ship explodes. What do you do now? You have your entire family with you, your wife, your 6 children, your niece, your sister, and the ship is sinking. What do you do? That's what the book is about. And then, 184 years later, someone finds that ship at the bottom of the ocean. The novel is a dual timeline story of a modern day museum curator who works somewhere exactly like where we are, called exactly what we call this. And then the historical timeline tells the story of two women who must survive that escapade. So that is what the book is about.
Now, I know you were ambivalent about writing this story.
I was.
It seemed like a big swallow. But what pushed you forward? Tell us the story about what the feelings were that you had that told you this story, not only that it had to be told, but that you had to be the one to tell it.
So a local friend of mine named Boo Harrell, who was a mariner in Bluffton, South Carolina, told me about this story so many times. I would run into him and he would say, "Have you researched yet the story of the Pulaski?" And I would say, "You know, Boo, I don't write about shipwrecks." And then he would print off the newspaper article and he would give it to me. And then a year later, I would run into him again and he would say, "Have you thought about writing about the Pulaski?" And I would say, "Boo, I don't write shipwrecks." This went on for probably 4 years. And then one day, I don't know why the timing was different, but he brought it up again. And he said, "Patti, have you read that newspaper article I keep printing off for you?" And I said, "No, but if you print it right now, I will read it today, and I promise, word of honor." And he did. And he printed it, and I took it home. And something about this time, I was totally intrigued. I had that little spidey sense. You know
Yeah.
that. We both have it.
Yeah.
You know, that thing that says, this would be really interesting. And I talked to Kathy about it, Mary Kay Andrews, and I said, "Do you think this is crazy? I don't write about the 1800s. I'm not an 1800s scholar." And she said, "Well, research is one of your favorite things." So I started to research it, but I hadn't decided. And like Mary Kay said, it was a bit of a chunk to bite off. I knew that this was going to require incredible research. So I started to do my research.
In secret.
In secret. I didn't tell anybody, except Mary Kay knew. And I started to read a little bit about the ship and do a little online research. And I woke up one morning to do my writing time and thought, I'm going to look a little more into this. This is about 3 weeks into my writing. And I hit upon a headline that said, "Pulaski remains found by endurance exploration. 100 feet deep, 30 miles off the coast of North Carolina." And once again, I got that spidey sense, chills down the back of my neck, and I knew that I was going to write this story. And I do believe that stories want to be told.
Yeah.
I do believe that sometimes, especially historical stories, are just waiting for the right time. I mean, I know you felt that way, that a
Yeah.
story you might have written before,
Yeah.
you pull up at a different time.
But you had to be the person to tell this story.
Yes, I wanted to be the person to tell this story. And the second thing that happened that prodded me forward, just when I was losing hope, and because it wasn't easy and it was hard to find the information about this simply amazing ship and the journey, because there was not one seminal book about it. There
Right.
wasn't one research book about it. And there were a couple times, to be honest, that I almost gave up.
Right,
You
yeah.
know that. And Kathy a couple times snatched me back from the ledge of giving up. And yet, the second thing that happened was the shipwreck hunters were bringing up the artifacts and the treasure and the gold and the silver, some of which we'll talk about in a moment. I was bringing up the lost stories of the passengers, and I finally decided to write about one very specific family and to tell the story from the point of view of one very specific woman. Her real name is Rebecca Lamar, but her fictional name in my book is Augusta Longstreet. And the shipwreck hunters found one name tag at the bottom of the ocean. One luggage tag at the bottom of the ocean, which we'll talk about in a minute. And it was my character's luggage tag. So I kept going.
Yeah, the subconscious was nudging you
Yep.
closer and closer and closer
Do
to
not
that
give
story.
up. Do not give up. Do not give up.
Well, I know that in historical fiction, it's important to stick to the real story, but it's fiction.
Yeah.
So how did you decide to weave together the past, the real story, and the story of this one fictional character, but she's inspired by a real person.
character.
So how did you do that?
With historical fiction, the question I get often
Right.
is what's real and what's fake? What's real and what's not true? And the question I like better is what's factual and what's imagined. And for my other historical fiction, it was biographical. It was about a person. It was about a woman named Joy Davidman. So that was a person.
Right.
This time, the biographical information to me was the ship. That was the part that I wanted to be completely accurate. That was the part that needed to be so factually based.
Right.
So I often say that with historical fiction, if you imagine it as a person, you imagine the story as a person, the bones of that person, the bones of that story
Right.
have to be strong,
Yeah.
or everything's going to cave in on it. So for me, I needed to know everything that happened that night. I needed to know the facts of the ship.
Right.
Like I said, they boarded with a $35 ticket. They left at 8 a.m. on June 13th, 1838. They went down, the paddle wheel started going, the river turned to white foam. They went out the river, past Tybee Island, where
Right.
you are, up the coast, docked in Charleston. New set of people came on. They left the next morning. Those facts I
Right.
needed to know. That at 11:04 p.m., the ship exploded. The ship broke in the middle on the starboard side. The bow and the aft went like, I feel like I need a ship model to do this. and the ship took 45 minutes to sink.
Wow.
And for those facts, they needed to be accurate. None of that I wanted to make up. There were 4 lifeboats. You can see 4 of them on this ship model at the Ships of the Sea Museum, and only 2 of them worked. 2 were not. Do you believe it? You think we'd finally learn about lifeboats? That's why it's called the Titanic of the South.
OSHA wasn't around back then.
No, but it did change maritime law
Yeah.
because of it. And only 2 of the lifeboats worked. I
Right.
needed to know which lifeboats were seaworthy, which ones weren't. And the facts were just hard to find, and that's why it took so long. But that's true. But the imagined parts are dual. The modern day character is completely imagined. But the historical characters are based on a very real family called the Gazaway Bug Lamar family. And you cannot make up a name like Gazaway Bug Lamar. And we can talk more about that, but I didn't do biographical, factual following of the family,
Sure.
but they inspired
Right.
my
I
novel.
always tell people with fiction, when I'm writing straight fiction, it doesn't have to be possible. It just has to be plausible.
Yes. I'm not writing speculative fiction or
Right.
science fiction. And so I did base Augusta Longstreet very much on Rebecca Lamar.
Right.
Because we have a full accounting of the night from Rebecca Lamar. We have a handwritten in her beautiful, tight script at the Georgia Historical Society. We have her full accounting of the night. And I really wanted to honor her.
Right.
As a woman, as a survivor, as a woman who tried to save her nieces and nephews. Won't tell you what happens. But as she spends her 5 days and 5 nights at sea trying to help and support others, I wanted to honor her, so I follow her story very closely.
Right.
So.
Okay, well, now we talked about the fact that Augusta survives. And I know I've heard you say more than once that the theme of Surviving Savannah is surviving the surviving. Why don't you talk a little bit about that?
I didn't know that at first. I don't
Right.
know about you, but I don't always know the theme of my book
I
when
don't
I
even,
start.
lots of times I don't even have a theme.
Yeah. And sometimes I go to a signing or a book event and somebody says, I love your theme of forgiveness, or I love your, and I go, sure, okay, thank you. But I did know about 3/4 of the way through this novel that the theme was surviving the surviving. And that's because I didn't want the book to be just about what happened that night. It exploded. It took 45 minutes to sink. About 23, 24 people made it onto a scrap of one piece of decking. About 12 people made it onto a piece of another decking. About 23 people made it into the lifeboats. And those facts were important, but also what happened to them after is important.
Right.
And I wanted to echo that also in the modern day story. And when it hit me what it was really about how do we survive the surviving, was when I learned the story of one of the children from the Gazaway Bug Lamar family. His name is Charlie Lamar. And he was 15 years old during this disaster. And he ended up with Rebecca Lamar, his aunt, Augusta Longstreet in the book. He ended up on a scrap of the promenade deck with a lot of other people, and they floated for 5 days and 5 nights at sea.
In the summertime.
In June. And a squall came up. There was, people felt, it was, you'll read about it. But he survived. And during those 5 days and 5 nights, he earned himself a nickname. And his nickname was the Noble Boy. But then when I did my research, 20 years later, he had an entirely new nickname, and it was the Red Devil. And when I researched why, it was for a lot of reasons, but one of them was that he had taken a ship called the Wanderer, which is off camera, but right here, right next to the Pulaski in the Ships of the Sea Museum. They are a few feet away from each other. And he had taken that ship, re-outfitted it, and sailed it to the Congo under the New York Yacht Club pennant and brought back 400 or more enslaved people from the Congo. He brought them, I get choked up when I think about it, he brought them to Jekyll Island, and it hit me. What about this idea of meant to be and fate and destiny, and that if somebody survives something, they become a better person
Right.
because they're given a second chance.
They have a nobler calling, maybe.
They have a nobler
Right.
calling, or they were meant to survive when some other people from their family did not survive, that they would do something good with their life. And I started to ask these bigger questions about fate and destiny and meant to be
Right.
and predestination, about who lives and who dies. And I don't answer that because I leave that up to the preachers and the philosophers. But I do want us to think about it. And I wanted it to be echoed in my modern day storyline, where the modern day character has lost her best friend, and she was standing right next to her during a terrible accident in Savannah. And I wanted her to be asking the same questions that we think about when we look at the passengers of the Pulaski, while honoring their stories.
Right. So the two stories kind of echo each other a little
Oh,
bit.
yes. And as each artifact is brought up from the ocean, just like in real life, I worked with the shipwreck hunters. And every time, his name is Micah Eldred from Endurance Exploration. And I have to send a million thanks to Endurance Exploration and Micah Eldred, because we worked together with Wendy Melton from the Ships of the Sea to start to talk about the artifacts. And with every artifact they found, the story shifted and changed.
Right.
And so I wanted it to happen in the book too, because it was happening in real life.
Yeah. Now, I know that you worked with more than one of the museums in Savannah
Yeah.
while you were doing the research. Would you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. One of the things I discovered in writing this book, one of my favorite things I discovered in writing this book, because the city of Savannah is a character in the book. It is the ground from which this story grows. It is the soil that
Sure.
this story grows from. Not only the mythology and the mystical parts of Savannah, but the reality and the bigger truth of Savannah. And I wanted to tell that story as an undergirding of the story, because we have 1838 and we have 2019. And I wanted to hold them up against each other as a mirror, as this was going on and was important, this was going on. And so I did a lot of my research here at the Ships of the Sea. And then there came a point where I needed some information about some silver that we'll talk about in a minute. And I ended up at the Owens Thomas House, which is a Telfair, and the slave quarters that they have refurbished. And I could not have done my research without the Georgia Historical Society. I dug through their boxes and their papers and sat at the long tables with the, gooseneck lamps and the puddle of light, and felt like I was Indiana Jones doing my research, and realized that Savannah is fascinating beyond most cities, and the stories in Savannah are endless. And I'm always interested in the untold stories. Just like I wanted to tell the untold story of the Pulaski, I always want to find that little nugget of something untold. And it hit me about 2.5 years into my research here in Savannah. The gems of the stories in Savannah, they're in the museums.
Right.
Our museums are our visual storytellers. We can read historical fiction, we can read nonfiction, and it's amazing. But if you want to see the ship, or you want to see the slave quarters, or you want to see the artifacts or the art, you have to go to the museums. And I just discovered this trail of gems in Savannah. And my daughter went to college here, to SCAD. I thought I knew a good bit about the city, but the museums are where you find the fuller story.
Yeah, I thought I knew a lot about Savannah. I've lived here and worked here and written books set in Savannah, done some research on the history too. But when you turned up the Pulaski, that was a story I'd never heard before.
Yeah, and these untold stories that are hidden inside what we think we know are shift, because the Pulaski changed Savannah.
Right.
They say that in June of 1838, the entire city shut down. They canceled the 4th of July. They say everyone in the city knew someone or loved someone who had perished on the Pulaski, but there is no monument anywhere. It changed maritime law after the Pulaski. Certified engineer had to be on every steamboat because the second engineer was the cause of the explosion. And it also changed maritime law in that owners started to be responsible for what happened, because nobody was responsible for this.
They were legally liable.
Legally liable. So.
Interesting.
So, speaking of museums, I am finally excited to really show you for the first time some of the artifacts from the Pulaski. I want to thank Endurance Exploration. They have loaned the Ships of the Sea and me these amazing artifacts. I have a big grand show and a big grand party, but thanks to COVID. But this is the first time we get to show you some of this. So I'm going to start with the pocket watch, because it is one of the very first things that affected me and made me want to tell the story. There was a pocket watch found at the bottom of the ocean that was stopped. Its hands were stopped at 11:04 p.m., which is exactly when the ship blew up. And when Micah sent me a picture of that pocket watch, I was speechless. It was a real, true showing of what happened that night. And so when I held this pocket watch for the first time, I felt like it was vibrating. I felt like it carried the stories of those who went down to their watery grave that night. Someone boarded the ship wearing this pocket watch. Someone boarded the ship with an Albert chain, walked up the gangplank, believing they would have one night at sea, heading north for the summer, carrying their silver, their china, their families. And what happened instead is this has been sitting at the bottom of the ocean for 184 years. And you can see the back. It is just exquisite, this pocket watch. The next thing they're letting us show tonight is this, and I know it's hard to see, and they won't let me take it out of the case, but this is Rebecca Lamar's luggage tag. When he showed me a picture of this luggage tag, it is a brass plate, and it has her initials R. Lamar on it. When he showed me that, right about the time I was about to give up on this book, that's when I knew that I had to keep going. The woman I was writing about, it seemed as if she was saying, keep going. Please tell my story. Please honor the passengers in this way. So this is Rebecca Lamar's luggage tag that would have been on her valise or her trunk and ended up at the bottom of the ocean until they just found it. The other thing is this silver. And we didn't clean it because I really wanted you to see how they found it. What this silver looks like after it comes off the bottom of the ocean. And the fascinating story about this silver is that when they first found it, Micah sent me a picture. And on the end of each piece of this silver, there is a set of initials. And the initials are C-E-K. And we women in the South know we love our monograms. Here is the smaller spoon that also has the C-E-K. And then the butter knife that has the initials C-E-K. And then the smaller spoon with the initials C-E-K. So these were found together in a big pile. And probably the reason they were found together in a big pile is because they were in a wooden trunk. And over 184 years, that wooden trunk disintegrated. And the silver was all found in one place together. Well, I became a little obsessed with finding out. A little? A lot. I became a lot obsessed with finding out where this silver came from.
Yes.
So I called Mary Kay and I said, I know you know Savannah well. I called Jessica Osborne from eShavers. I said, I know you know Savannah well. Who do I talk to about silver? How do I find the owners of this silver? And we were trying to figure out, because there's also an MLK. Is it sisters? Is it a mother-daughter? I probably didn't write on the book for a month because I was so obsessed with finding out who owned the silver that had come from the bottom of the ocean. But what is so amazing is that this silver led me, thanks to Mary Kay and Jessica, it led me to the Thomas Owens House and Slave Quarters, which is one of the Telfair museums here in Savannah, because they could educate me on the markings on the back of the silver. I know it's really hard to see because I purposefully didn't have it cleaned, but there are markings. People who have silver, they know there are maker's marks on the back of the silver. And the maker's marks on this, it took us a bit to find out. The Thomas Owens House pulled out this huge book of 1800s markings, and we found it and realized that it had been made in Rhode Island. But that's all I had, that it had been made in Rhode Island or fashioned in Rhode Island and had the initials, the monogram C-E-K. Well, I gave up. I had to finish a book. I gave up. Then when I finished the book, I realized that there was no full manifest that was ever printed anywhere about the Pulaski. So I decided that I was going to spend another month, another long time, trying to make a full manifest. And so I gathered every article, every newspaper article from 1838, every accounting, every journal, every chapter in every book, and I put it together and I made a final manifest, and then I wrote who perished, who survived, and who they were with. And I found a passenger I hadn't seen before named Sylvanus Keith. So I looked him up. He was from Rhode Island. And that thing happened again. Chill bumps. He was from Rhode Island, but he didn't have the right initials. I did a little further research, and his daughter was married. He had boarded that ship, 68 years old, with his daughter Caroline, which is the C, her husband George Washington Coy, and her daughter Caroline. And they all perished. And I felt like this silver was saying, thank you for honoring us and trying to figure out who we were. So it took me about 3 years, but it also, Caroline's silver led me to the Thomas Owens house and slave quarters, where I learned even more about 1838 and the bigger truths of Savannah, the fuller story of Savannah. And this one is so fascinating to all of us because we are not exactly sure what it is. What did you say it might be, Mary Kay?
A reliquary.
That word, a reliquary. It is a beautiful, obviously religious piece of art with an engraving of, I don't know, a saint. It has lions. It has 6 pointed suns. And someone out there knows what this is. I know you do. But this was brought on board, or maybe it was part of the Pulaski, and was just brought up from the bottom of the ocean. So this is just a teaser of some of the artifacts you'll get to see next spring. And this is some of the most important things to me when I was writing the book. Every single one of these things right here are in my novel. This is not, but each one of these pieces ended up in the novel. So now we get to answer your questions. Tell us what you want to know.
Yeah, she went way down that rabbit hole.
Yes, I did. It probably wouldn't have taken me so long to write if I hadn't gone so far down the rabbit hole.
Okay, we got some questions. Why do you think the Pulaski tragedy wasn't well known before you decided to dig in?
I don't know. It's one of the first things I asked Wendy Melton at the Ships of the Sea was, yes, obviously it's well known enough to have this amazing to scale model, but why haven't we heard the story? In my novel, I do have a monument down at the Savannah River, which is not real, but I felt like there should have been a monument. There should have been, and why is a mystery to me. Why there's not a book about it, or, you know, there were a couple chapters in books about steamship disasters. Maybe steamship disasters were so common then. Right before this disaster, there was a disaster called the Home. A ship called Home had same thing had happened. Not enough life rafts, not enough, you know, it exploded. People, I don't know, but it is called the Titanic of the South for a reason. And part of that not only is the lifeboats, but the fact that so many of the families on the ship were influential Savannah families. Hardly anybody was not affected by this
Sort of
disaster.
the flower of Savannah society at the time.
Yes, flowers of the South.
Okay, someone else wants to know, what is your favorite part of the writing process? Is it the research or the actual writing? And here's a good one. How do you know when to stop the research and start writing?
Oh, that's so hard. And I just told you a story about how I fell down the research rabbit hole and obviously stopped the writing for the research. But I feel like that led me to an even better novel, because the research rabbit hole about the silver led me to another museum and a greater history of the enslaved of that time, and the complicated history and what that meant for my characters and what it meant for the ship itself, why people took whole trunks of silver with them and gold when they traveled. I learned so much more by falling down that rabbit hole that I don't know if it's always such a bad idea. It's never wasted time. But I don't know which one I love better. I love them like my children, the same.
Well, I think too, part of the gift you had with writing this book was that you, it wasn't under contract. This was your little secret passion project, right?
Yes. So I was plowing away at it thinking, when I figure out what I want to say, then I'll figure out what I want to say.
Right, but you didn't have an editor breathing down your neck.
Not yet.
Not at that point.
Not yet.
Somebody else wants to know if you've had any dreams about the Pulaski or the characters.
I didn't have any dreams about the characters. I wish I did. I know you've dreamed endings, and one of your books, you dreamed her over and over till you asked her what she wanted, and she told you. But I did have some drowning dreams, which was hard.
Yeah.
But when you're writing about these people trying to survive in the middle of the Atlantic, I had one dream where I was in a room and the water was coming. You don't want to know. But yes, I did. I dreamt about it.
It probably meant you needed to get up and go to the bathroom.
It probably did. Or it probably meant I needed to fall down another research rabbit hole and stop writing about drowning.
Have you had any relatives of the people you wrote about contact you?
No, I haven't. What we have to remember is that this was almost 200 years ago.
Right.
So it's what, 5th, 6th generation?
At least.
And the book came out today, so might be able to answer that differently later.
Wouldn't that be cool?
Yeah, it would be really cool to hear from someone who says, I know that I have a survivor or a perished, the Pulaski in my family.
Because you've had that experience with writing about
Mrs. Lewis.
Mrs. Lewis and C.S. Lewis. Everybody who ever considered themselves an expert or an authority on that topic has surely reached out to you.
Oh yes, for good and for bad. But the biggest thing that happened when I wrote that book is that her son found me.
Right.
And we are now very dear friends. So
it could happen.
It could happen. I would love to talk to somebody.
Maybe some of the Gazaway, Bug
Lamar family. I know there are some. And also the McKay family was on this ship.
Sure.
And there were a lot of, the Hutchinsons were on this ship, the Seabrooks were on this ship from Edisto.
Right.
There were some very famous families.
Yeah, South Carolina family.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody else wants to know, is this event related to the Pulaski Monument?
No. So that is something that even I was confused about at the beginning. So Casimir Pulaski is what all things Pulaski are named after. He was the father of the cavalry, and he fought in the Revolutionary War for America, but he was Polish. But he died off the coast of Savannah fighting in the Revolutionary War.
And that was during the Siege of Savannah?
I think it was the Siege of Savannah. And so he's honored all over the city of Savannah. There's a Fort Pulaski, there's a Pulaski Square, there's a Pulaski Monument. But this ship was named after him, but has nothing to do with the fort or the monument.
Right, about 100 years later, right?
Yes,
Okay.
Much later.
Okay, someone wants to know, will replicas of the luggage tags be available for purchase at the museum? And if not, why not?
That is genius. I don't know who asked that, but that is genius. And I'm going to answer for the museum and say we're going to figure that out, because I would like one. I actually asked the shipwreck hunter if I could have this, and he said no. I think that's a genius idea. That's a great idea.
Now, has the museum, the Ships of the Sea Museum, have they digitized any of these artifacts yet, or is that going to be in the process?
That's in the process. This is the first time they've ever let us see them. This is literally the grand first time that Wendy and I have ever touched or seen any of the artifacts. So nothing yet is digitized, or it'll all be happening this year. And what is also really fascinating is that they have only found 5% of the artifacts and treasures at the bottom of the ocean.
But there are other things beyond these.
Oh,
things.
they have candlesticks and jewelry and gold and silver. This is a very tiny sampling of what they have found. And yet it's still only 5% of what they think they will find. Because this ship broke in half over 45 minutes, it was floating that whole 45 minutes, so it was leaving a trail on the bottom of the ocean for 45 minutes while it just kept dumping things, which is why it's extraordinary that my character's luggage tag was found, because with only 5% of the ship's booty, they probably wouldn't want me to call it that, found, there's so much more to discover down there.
Yeah. How far off the coast did they find the wreck?
30 miles off the coast, 100 feet deep. So they have a boat that out of Wilmington, and they go back and forth from Wilmington to the site. And they're still diving it. They're still searching it.
And you still want to go, don't you?
I want to go so much. I was just about to go when COVID hit. And I had originally thought about scuba diving and going down there with them, but it's 100 feet deep. It's a double tank technical dive. And we both have a very dear friend, the author Jocelyn Jackson, who is a hardcore scuba diver. And I turned to her for the scuba diving parts of the book, because you get to scuba dive. I didn't, but you get to in this book. And I made her read it, asked her to read it and see if it was right. And she kept going, you can do it. You can go down there. I'm like, yeah, no, I'm good. I'll let them do that.
I'll stay on dry land.
I'll stay. You go down there and tell me what you see. Take some pictures.
But you know, your character was terrified to dive, right?
Yes. And I made
Your modern day contemporary character.
Yep. And I was terrified to go myself, and so I probably just projected that onto my character.
Which is not a bad thing to do.
No, and she became brave enough to do it. So, and you can see all of the other exhibits, all of the other artifacts next spring. And I think we ran out of time and have to wind this up. Mary Kay, thank you for doing this with me.
Oh, thank you for inviting me. I'm just.
Isn't this fascinating?
This stuff is just amazing to me.
And I want to thank all of you for coming and supporting the Ships of the Sea and supporting E. Shaver Bookseller, the oldest bookseller in Savannah. And I want to thank Endurance Exploration and Micah Eldred. And I want to thank Good Cause for helping me do this, Marianne and Kendra. And this has been an extraordinary way to kick off an extraordinary lost story. Y'all, thank you for coming.